what I look at in terms of the work that I do focuses on, I would say probably one of the main goals of this nation, when you look at e pluribus unum, and how it really didn't start that way from a nationalistic perspective, that how we really get to a place where people feel like the person sitting next to them, regardless of their background, regardless of their skin color, their sexual orientation, whatever it may be, that we really are equal and that everybody adds value. So with that, the deconstruction of white supremacy is, I would say, at the forefront, because with that sort of ideology undergirding everything that happens in terms of policy, in terms of perception, that we're really looking at roots of this nation that need to be perhaps unrooted. So with that how do I help people shift their perceptions of who they are and who the other is, and look at how we perceive one another in a very unified way. And so for me, as somebody right here with the privilege of being a professor, the privilege of my credentials, is what do I do with this privileged status to try to open up the hearts in a way in which we look at this master narrative that is written in such a way that it perpetuates exclusion, moral exclusion, which is a term I learned from Brene Brown, and the moral exclusion of, I believe in goodness as long as it's only pertaining to people that look like me and believe like me. So how do you open up that sort of thinking and get them to recognize that they too were given sanctuary at one time? When I started teaching here, it was remarkable that as I started teaching the multicultural counseling classes in the counseling department here, I found that as we started talking about difficult topics, that students got very polarized based on race. So I'd have my Euro-American students on one side, and I have my students of color, and you could feel the anguish, you could feel the shame on one side, and you could feel the anger on another. And for me, as a professor, my job is to try to help everybody get to the place where they can work from a perspective of social justice, work in a cross-cultural context, and to identify areas in which they themselves have to interject themselves to change the way people perceive themselves, and even the way they perceive others. And sometimes it means even changing the climate of where people may be embedded, right? So, but you have to do that from a place of seeing our communities and what needs to change to make our communities safe for everybody. I would see my white students learn about the Robert Shaws, the Angelina Grimke's, the William Lloyd Garrisons, that it started to change the way they perceived themselves, because it was no longer where white people had done all these awful things to all these people. And then it became, you can't think dichotomously. There were some white people who did awful things. Not everybody owned slaves. Not everybody was committing genocide. In fact, there were many people who were escaping and going to Native Americans and living with them and amongst them. So what happens when we start to magnify those individuals and start teaching all people about, we had white people who were exploitive, and we had white people who were saying, that's wrong, and we need to stop that sort of behavior. I'll never forget that as I started going out and presenting this information, just to test it out, because I had a hunch that there was a deficit in the way that Euro-Americans perceived themselves and their contributions in this country. And certainly there's the exploitive side, the non-humanistic side, but my efforts have been, that's a reality, we have to understand where that comes from and how to stop that. But on the other hand, how do we promote people's capacity to see themselves positively? And there was one young lady that, as I was talking about the humanist, she looks up, and she was kind of quiet young lady in one of our classes, and she looked up and she was looking at these images of Angelina Grimke and Sarah Shaw, and she says, I want to be one. And that's what I want. as I want to build that capacity for people to see themselves not as the white race, but as part of the human race. And when we can bring people back together as one race, now we take the energy out of that divisive language. So how do we now come to humanize everybody and to develop that sort of compassion? What's fascinating is with What is the Color of Your Heart, that book, and now in a number of classes, the doctoral class, the diversity class, in the multicultural counseling classes, as well as the undergraduate counseling minor classes. What's fascinating is hearing the stories from my students, our students in these classes, and I don't even teach these classes, but oftentimes the professors will give me some data from the voices and maybe their final papers, and in seeing maybe like a young Latina or a Hmong individual or a young white male talking about how they now hold these individuals in high esteem. And what was fascinating is when I started doing the research for What is the Color of Your Heart, that my intention was to look at how to look at Euro-American modeling of how they perceive themselves. What I did not know was going to be an outcome of the research and of the book was a perception of how people of color then look at white people. Because then what I saw was this awareness that, oh my God, I don't have to be mistrustful of all white people, right? Because there's that distrust that goes both ways, right? Fear of white people against people of color, which you see the language now of trying to fear people, that we're all criminals and rapists and so forth. But then with people of color, the sense of exploitation and being treated like an animal, right? Because of that fear and because of that sense of not perceiving other human beings as humans. Happiness is not always about having, but it's about being in the way of life and being in relationship with others, and even being in relationship with the earth and that sort of connection where you take joy in the birds singing and life. That there's a joy to that, and rather than raping the earth and exploiting one another, how do we work on something that's much more positive, that we know even from a biological place that it's fulfilling for us as well?